Most people my age have a nostalgia for this movie that is frankly off the goddamn charts. What can I honestly say about the 2002 Sam Raimi Spider-Man film? It was probably one of the most important superhero films of its time, and it was a really big deal to us kids back then. I just remember the adverts being plastered all over the place on bus stands and buses and those big highboards and whatnot, and I remember all the toys and the adverts and the merchandise. And during the last term of school that year, we actually got to see this movie on VHS. Yeah, I remember those. And it just blew my mind. And then a couple of months after, I got the film on DVD. So I have a very personal connection to this film. It just opened my mind to just the scope and expanse of action filmmaking. This was in that post-Matrix boom when you had action films with just this colossal sense of scope and acrobatics, and just seeing Spider-Man on climbing up walls or fighting the Goblin at such ridiculous heights. It was just an incredible thing, and it was completely different to what I knew at the time from the Tim Burton Batman films. This was just so dynamic and fluid in its action, and it had a hero who was more directly relatable at the time, which, again, another key difference from what most of us knew back then. And of course, even now, there are another number of aspects that I do like. Most of the action still holds up. The supporting cast are pretty good overall, with an amazing J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah, who is practically the character right off the page. And Willem Dafoe is, of course, tons and tons of fun as the Goblin. And, well, it helps when your movie's got a pre-2005 Danny Elfman score when he was still not in his repetition cycle. Just indulging in its all-American high-adventure flavor, and it is an absolute joy, especially during the ending when Spider-Man is swinging across the city. So, what in the world could I have a problem with? Well, let's take Sam Raimi out of the equation for a moment and look at the script as written by David Koepp, who was basically for a time the other Shane Black. If there was an action film during the 90s and early 2000s that was based on another source material, you can bet your money at some point David Koepp was involved. He did Jurassic Park, The Shadow, Men in Black, as well as a couple of original pieces that had a certain high profile to them, like The Paper, which starred pretty much all the big names of the 90s and directed by Ron Howard. In retrospect, Koepp is rather a hit-or-miss screenwriter, and frankly, looking at this again with much older and more experienced eyes, and after having dabbled in the screenplay field myself a couple of times, it makes me appreciate just how much Alvin Sargent contributed when he wrote Spider-Man 2. Koepp's script isn't bad, but there are just aspects about it that really just grind on me now that I'm older. When I was a kid, I didn't mind because I was just like, wow, Spider-Man! But now they just really bug me, and it doesn't help that, of course, the newer one has come out from Mark Webb, which also had Sargent on board, along with James Vanderbilt and Harry Potter scribe Steve Kloves. And I felt that one just did it a lot better. But that's a story for next time. Back to this film. I guess most of my issues can be traced down to, well, Koepp's version of Peter Parker. Now, it would be easy for me to make fun of Tobey Maguire like just about everybody else has, and in retrospect, I'd be lying if I said Andrew Garfield didn't really hit the character a lot better. Aside from having a more youthful appearance, Garfield behaved and acted in a manner that I know and have seen many times from many kids my age growing up through secondary and college and university. He felt like a real kid to me. This Peter definitely feels like an archetype, and that, in retrospect, really hurts his relatability factor. While he did get better in 2 and, well, completely dropped the ball in Part 3, here Maguire sort of kinda just stands there, really. His performance is neither really good nor bad. He's just kind of blasé, and very often he's just kind of like Rodney Dangerfield, where his eyes are just staring out into space during half the shots. And frankly, he doesn't have a voice that is exactly going to give Morgan Freeman a run for his money anytime soon, which kind of drains some of the pizzazz out of the funnier lines that Spider-Man delivers. But performance aside, the character itself is where I have my biggest issues. My issues with the character stem from the fact that he's not proactive enough and that a lot of his character traits are just kind of dumped after they've served a plot point. Peter is a science guy, of course that goes without saying, but this only seems to matter for the first 20 minutes of the movie when he's at the museum. After that event, where of course he gets bitten by the spider, he doesn't bother to really study his condition. Of course he does all the yay and woo and goes swinging about, which leads to slapstick hilarity, but if he's such a science whiz, why doesn't he bother trying to test himself? Maybe using some of the equipment down at the high school. Maybe seeing how the affairs affected his genetic makeup. Or fully testing out the parameters and limits of his new abilities. Perhaps even doing research into spiders as well, and fully comprehending what their abilities are and how they have been passed on to him. But nothing is made of this. In The Amazing Spider-Man, by comparison, after getting his powers, Peter actually does some research into spiders, trying to understand their abilities and some of the side effects of being bitten by one and how that relates to his present situation. Plus, it also helps that in that script they actually bring the science stuff to the forefront and actually make it relevant throughout the story. Here, once that opening bit is done with the spiders, and it's really only there just so that Harry can steal some of Peter's lines and try to woo Mary Jane with his quote-unquote scientific knowledge, after that point it never matters again in the rest of the story. He doesn't try and understand how the Goblin has the powers from a scientific standpoint, nor does he question where the technology for the Goblin comes from. Indeed, this knocks into the proactivity aspect. Sure, he may fight crime as Spider-Man, but really he's not what we would call the most investigative of minds. And this wouldn't be such a big deal if this was the first time round and he was just a kid experimenting with his powers and just happened to stumble into all of this. But he got a job at the Daily Bugle. One of the advantages in the comics that came from this was the fact that he had access to their archives and he could do research on big news stories and try and see what he could glimmer as clues as to what, say, a villain's origin was or what their next scheme would be. But here, Co-op never really utilizes this. Really, the most the Bugle ever matters for is just, one, to give Peter a job, because, well, that's what Peter Parker has always done. Which in turn is just a lead-in so that we can get some scenes with JJ, which, while funny, admittedly, don't feel like they have enough of a consequence in the main story. Beyond, of course, Goblin attacking once. As well as a rather limited amount of the whole Spider-Man's reaction and reception from the public. Which actually kinda doesn't make sense that he, during that whole bit about when Goblin's like, in spite of everything that you have done for them, they will eventually hate you. Because pretty much throughout the film, the public pretty much embraces him. Yeah, you get that one guy who's like, he stinks and I don't like him. But that's it. Apart from Jonah and him, everybody seems cool with him. So that scene kind of loses a little bit of power in retrospect. Even when the Goblin's attacks intensify and he starts attacking Peter's loved ones, he doesn't bother to think maybe he should look into what is going on, maybe browse through the Daily Bugle archives and see if there's any stories that could be potentially related to this. Maybe then he can figure out clues and find out that somehow Oscorp is linked to this. Maybe even finally draw a connection to Norman Osborn himself. But, nope. You could still have all the lovey-dovey stuff with Mary Jane and still have Peter actually try and be a little more direct in dealing with the Goblin. It's not like one has to be sacrificed for the other, although admittedly, given some of the dialogue during those scenes, yeah, they could have gone. And then, of course, comes the Goblin, which is one of those instances where the performance actually trumps what's on the page. Willem Dafoe gives it his all, and he is undeniably a ton of fun to watch on screen, but when you actually look at how his character is written, it's head-scratchingly sloppy. This sloppiness mainly comes down to what is his motivation. Once you get past that he kills the entire board of directors out of revenge like he originally wanted to after they fire him, What purpose does he really serve in the story? Why does he obsess over Spider-Man so much? And why does he want to do the tired trope of wanting to team up with him to take over the city? Why? Now, of course, it's easy to use just the generic card of, well, he's insane, so how can you expect him to really have consistency? But that's just lazy writing. The Joker in The Dark Knight was insane and often had a shifting mentality, but fundamentally his goal was the same throughout. He wanted to cause chaos and challenge Batman. Here, Goblin's motivation once he kills the board of directors pretty much evaporates. The whole idea here is that, of course, the Goblin is the darker side of Norman Osborn unleashed. He's doing the things that, as he himself says, Norman won't do, which is primarily have a bit of a backbone. But considering he pretty much removes the only thing that was really stopping Norman Osborn, which is the directors and, of course, the other military project, which I'm going to get to in a moment because it's actually another head-scratching thing about the film, what possible interest could Osborn have in running and taking over the city? There's nothing about him that indicates he's political, and frankly, the Goblin isn't exactly equipped to take on a huge amount of opponents. I mean, frankly, a bunch of people on a bridge with soda cans and baseball bats seem to pretty much be a decent challenge for him. So how exactly does the Goblin think he's going to even remotely pull this off? And furthermore, why does he really care about Spider-Man? Sure, Spider-Man damaged his glider, but really he failed to stop him from killing the board of directors. So why in the world does he care so much? That would be like if Joker was interested in Batman even though he failed to stop him from, say, creating the Laughing Fish or killing Commissioner Gordon. At the end of the day, you should just kind of write him off as another costume goofball and just get on with whatever it is you're doing. Again, the insanity card really only gets you so far before eventually you have to wonder, okay, David, did you really think this out? And of course there are a number of little conveniences like the fact that Goblin happens to attack the Bugle when Peter is there, even though really there's nothing to indicate that the Goblin would honestly give a damn what people write about him. I mean, it's not like he's looking for public support, so why does he waste his time doing that? It's only there so he can conveniently capture Spider-Man and have the little rooftop scene where, of course, he talks about taking over the city, which, again, doesn't really make any practical sense. And speaking of practical sense, the whole thing that leads up to the creation of the Goblin is the termination of Osborn's contract with the military. They choose to go to a rival company which basically have a pretty bad product. I mean, at least with Norman, the bodysuit and the glider actually work. And of course we see all the other weaponry like the pumpkin bombs also function. Though, frankly, how the dissolving people to skeleton bombs works, or how even he developed that technology and why didn't he try and sell that to the military instead, considering it would be a more useful weapon, who knows. But in this instance, at least you've got functional tech. The other company develops this cumbersome bodysuit that can only get a couple of feet off the ground and could probably easily be taken out even by a couple of ground soldiers. So why exactly would you push your money away? Sure, Osborn may be a little sloppy with the deadlines, but are you going to honestly spend the government's money on inferior tech that can't even perform halfway decently? Now, after my little laundry list of gripes there, you're probably thinking that I absolutely revile this film. But I don't. As I mentioned in the opening, I still have fun with it, and it holds a lot of very personal affection for me. In fact, if I can sort of play devil's advocate for a moment, let's go back to the Goblin for a minute, specifically the costume. I've heard a lot of reviewers complain that they have no idea where that costume came from, but really, I don't know how they could have missed it. There's an interview on the special edition DVD which actually talks about why they went with this outfit. They point out that at the time, the purple hat and boots just would not have worked, and I agree with them. Remember, this was during that X-Men phase when they were trying to ground the heroes in a certain level of reality. You couldn't quite do the outlandish stuff. This was still 10 years before Avengers and other films like X-Men First Class. So at the time, the public needed a fair amount of at least semi-reality in their comic book films. And frankly, considering that the only thing Norman really had to build in this instance was the Goblin mask, it doesn't look horrible. I mean, yeah, it looks like a Power Rangers outfit, but you have to look at it in the time that it was made in. That's kind of what was in. And well, frankly, that's all I have to offer at this point. Join me next time when I'll talk about Mark Webb's film.